Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Especially grateful to you for joining us on such a wintry day here in November.
It's Yorkshire weather.
Yes, absolutely perfect weather. I'm Niall Gardner, the director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom. I'll be moderating today's discussion, and we have three terrific guests joining us from London for a very timely discussion of the latest developments on Brexit, but also the big picture with regard to a US-UK free trade deal. Our first guest is the Right Honourable David Davis, MP, UK Member of Parliament for Halton Price and Howden, former UK Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. In the middle, we have the Right Honourable Owen Paterson, MP, UK Member of Parliament for North Shropshire, former UK Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and former Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And lastly, we have Shankar Singham, Head of Trade, Centre for Economic and Business Research, Director of International Trade and the Competition Unit at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. And so a superb panel to address the very latest developments from London, and there have been quite a few of those developments today. So the first part of our discussion, I'll be asking questions directly of our guests. The second half, we will open the discussion up to members of the audience, members of the press, who can ask their questions. So an opening question for our guests, and perhaps David, if you could respond first. What is your reaction to the Prime Minister's Brexit deal, which has just been unveiled and is a subject of tremendous controversy in London, to put it mildly?
Yeah, well, it's a very bad deal. I hope you like the way we choreographed all this to make this more interesting for you this time. But it's a very poor deal from all sorts of points of view. I mean, first start off by understanding this is a huge opportunity, or should be a huge opportunity done properly. You know, world trade needs a fillip. It's been stagnating. The direction of policy travel on regulation and free trade has been poor. Needed a new player, a new big player in the G7 to sort of free themselves to come onto the field. And this will deny that. This will actually stop that happening. I'll come back in a second. But in essence, the proposal to keep us effectively in a customs area, indeterminate, I think is the phrase used, for an indeterminate period of time. Well, actually, it could be a never-ending period of time because we can't decide to leave. It's a decision in which the European Union's got to agree. So that's the first problem. Could go on forever. Second problem is we're tied into all sorts of regulatory concerns, in particular the so-called non-regression clause, which means we have to match European Union law over employment law, over environmental law, over a whole series of bits of law. Again, ties our hands and takes away an opportunity for us. Thirdly, actually, is a threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom. I mean, the proposals for Northern Ireland, effectively treating it separately, is in defiance of the Good Friday Agreement because it doesn't take both communities on board. And of course, it undermines the position of Scottish Unionists because it will actually the Scot Nats will start saying, well, why can't we have this? You know? So a whole series of problems with it, and frankly, I think it's beyond the pale. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that this can be rewritten to be right. We have to reset the whole thing and go at it again.
Excellent. And Owen, you've had a lot of experience of negotiating things with the EU in the past. What's your view of this deal that the Prime Minister is offering?
Oh, it is just so bad, it cannot be allowed to proceed. 17.4 million people voted in an in-and-out referendum. They were told they were given deciding power. They voted to leave. Lots of Remainers then waved their arms around and said, what does leave mean? And the Prime Minister very helpfully confirmed that leave means leave the single market, leave the customs union, leave the remit of the European Court of Justice. And that was what was written into our manifesto, on which he, in fairness, got the second largest number of votes since John Major, far more than Tony Blair used to get in his so-called landslides. So it is bitterly disappointing. It completely fails on those three main points. We will be locked into the regulatory regime. as our share of trade with Europe goes down, it was over 60% at the millennium, it's now about 45, it's going to be below 35. The European Union itself, the Commission says that 95% of world growth is going to be outside the European Union. And as David just said, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to emerge from behind the wall of the customs union and retake our place on all the world bodies and really drive through reform of world regulation, being pro-technology, because the European Union is quite extraordinarily hostile to modern technology, and also to propose policies at world level which are pro-competition and pro-free trade. And as David touched on, very importantly, it's a grotesque breach of the Belfast Agreement. The absolute key plank, which got very large numbers of unionists to vote for the agreement and swallow some very difficult things, was the principle of consent. And, as David Trimble has made very clear in an important paper last week, give the Assembly, which as we know is currently suspended, but there are Assembly members there, give the Assembly a clear role. And neither of those are in this agreement. And that is really bad and has a possible very serious spin-off in Scotland. And then lastly, as David touched on, there's no way out of this. At the moment, we're in a very clearly legally binding process under treaty, which is Article 50, which gave us the opportunity at any time, following the Treaty of Lisbon, to leave, according to our own constitutional arrangements, and there's a strict 2-year period. On this, there's no clear way out. We could be in for decades, as the Norwegians have found with the EEA. That was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, and they're still stuck, and the Turks have still found with their customs union arrangement. So that is really bad, and it's very, very expensive. We're going to cough up 39 billion sterling for the privilege of participating. If we get into the next financial round, which is the 31st December 2020, we are locked into even higher sums of money. And these are real sums of money. 1 billion sterling buys you 20,000 nurses, it buys you 20,000 teachers, it buys you well over 20,000 soldiers, and we're going to spend 39 billion on just being participants in this whole operation. So it is a really, really bad deal, and it will cost us, because we used to be a pebble in the shoe when law was made. I'll end on this. I was involved in CAP negotiations when I was doing DEFRA. We worked closely with certain allies on certain issues. We got some of the worst things stopped. It was not a good agricultural round, but we got some of the worst things stopped. And I was in Holland last week, and the Dutch made it very clear they will miss us, because law will now be cooked up by 27 countries. We will not be in the room. We will have to accept that law without amendment, without ability to repeal it. And that law will be a lot more costly.
It's significant, the huge amount of money that will be transferred to Brussels. And Margaret Thatcher, when she was the Prime Minister, worked to get money going the other way back to the UK, but all of this money is going to the EU. And as you mentioned, at least 39 billion pounds. Shankar, you've studied a large number of international trade deals and agreements. What's your verdict on Theresa May's plan?
Well, I think we can get sort of lost in the day-to-day Brexitology or today, minute-to-minute Brexitology. I think sometimes it's useful to take a step back. David talked about this big opportunity here. And the Prime Minister, in fact, talked about this in her Lancaster House speech in 2017. She talked about a Brexit Prize. Well, what is that prize? There is no, at least economically, not politically or for other reasons, but economically, the prize is the exercise of your independent trade and regulatory policy. It's nothing else. If you don't have an independent trade and regulatory policy, then you are in a damage limitation exercise by definition. You are in a non-optimal situation by definition. But from a US perspective, or from any other country in the world perspective, this is a massive global event. You've got a G7 nation that's adopting trade policy for the first time, independent trade policy for the first time in 40 plus years. This has never happened before with any country of any serious size, and it will never happen again. At least we assume it will never happen again. So this is a huge global opportunity. Why is it a global opportunity? Because, as David said, the direction of travel of global regulation is negative. We've increased global protectionism around the world dramatically since the financial crisis. We have the global trading system is stalled. We've seen very little services liberalisation. We've seen very little trade liberalisation seriously in the last 23 years. No concluded round in the WTO for 23 years, which is a third of the lifetime of the GATT. And unsurprisingly, economic indicators as a result are very poor. Now, when somebody like Christine Lagarde says, we're going to have a 2%, developed countries can expect a new normal of 2% growth forever, that's a good result. It's because it's not, the fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. It's because we constantly are increasing regulatory barriers, we're increasing protectionism. As Azevedo said recently, not only are we going in the wrong direction, but we are accelerating. So this is the context for this decision, and this is why the prize is so big. So from a US perspective, where you have a global regulatory battleground, where the EU's direction of travel is increasingly anti-competitive and prescriptive for reasons that Owen mentioned, not just in agriculture, but in goods and in product regulation. You have China imposing its regulatory system on its near abroad, and you have the EU also imposing its regulatory system through things like GDPR and so on. So this is the background in which we are faced. And in that context, the UK adopting independent trade and regulatory policy is a massive global event. It represents huge opportunities, and if I was the US, I would not want to be a spectator in this process. I would want to be an active participant to ensure that I could have another ally, or at least one ally, on the global stage that promoted competition, pro-competitive regulatory systems, open trade, all of the things that we would need to have. And there are countries that the UK can reach that the US perhaps can't reach in ways that we can. Countries like China and India and so on, in terms of trade agreements that we might be able to do with them to correct distortions in their market. So I see terrific opportunities with this moment. Now then you go to the withdrawal agreement and you say, well, what does the withdrawal agreement do to those opportunities? Well, first of all, the backstop, which is a treaty. It's very important to understand this. This is not a political declaration. This is a treaty that we will be signed up to. It's a treaty that puts Northern Ireland in the European Single Market and Customs Union, and the UK in a customs union with the EU. It puts the UK, and the withdrawal agreement specifically says that for the future relationship, that customs union relationship will be the basis for a customs arrangement between the UK and the EU, where we will be part of one customs territory. This means you have no trade policy, and you can only get out of it if the EU agrees. So therefore, it becomes a negotiating, part of the negotiating mechanics. We want to have a comprehensive trade deal with the EU that has lots of regulatory cooperations, lots of customs facilitations, and Irish border facilitations. They also want that. That has been their offer to the UK. We must be able to agree between ourselves a landing zone, but they will have no incentive to meet us halfway if the default, if we fail to get an agreement, is basically for us to be locked into the customs union with full regulatory alignment with European regulation. And it means that no country can do trade deals with us. It means that terrific opportunity of having a global player, second biggest exporter of services, one of the biggest sites of foreign investment, one of the biggest foreign investors in the world, completely irrelevant in terms of international trade policy, completely irrelevant in terms of foreign policy, really, and increasingly simply a mini version of the EU. So I think if you look at all the things we could do in our trade policy, in international fora, trade agreements, accession to the TPP, all of the things that actually, to the credit of the Department for International Trade, are very much on the table for the UK right now. All of them are completely taken off the table by this deal.
Well, that's a pretty devastating critique, and clearly on the US side, the Trump administration should be very concerned about this deal, what it means for a US-UK free trade agreement in the future of the special relationship. Could you comment on that, David, in terms of the impact on a potential US-UK free trade deal? It's now going to be likely far more difficult to secure agreement,
Hugely more
even impossible, possibly?
Yeah, I think probably impossible. I mean, what's been interesting talking to US officials just on this trip, let alone previous ones, is that their view is that we are basically, contrary to what Obama said, we're at the front of the queue for a new trade deal. They've already started the 90-day process. Yeah. They're in a good position, really, to start talking Turkey in the end of March, March 30th. So that opportunity is sitting there, ready to go. Biggest possible trade deal that we could do with any one country. But to do a trade deal, you've got to be able to negotiate with your opposite number on external tariffs. We can't do that. You've got to be able to negotiate on regulation and market access, which are the two sides of the same coin. We can't do that. So, it's, at one level, it's a trade deal that takes 10 seconds to do because there's nothing you can do in it. So it has thrown away a big opportunity. Can I add one other thing, Niall, just listening to my two colleagues talk here? And it's the poverty or the weakness of the negotiation that we've got ourselves into. Owen mentioned the 39 billion. What we've done is we haven't agreed it yet, but if we were to agree this deal, we will be agreeing to a 39 billion pig in a poke. There is no future commitment, or no future commitment that we would like to see in terms of future economic partnership. We have got our fingers in the mangle in terms of being pulled into further and further in, because the temporary customs arrangement is listed as being basically, my words, the foundation for the next stage. So actually, we're going to be tied in with this procedure in the long run. And also, during the course of the negotiation, the European Union kept saying, well, we're going to do the withdrawal agreement first and the future partnership second, right? All the future economic stuff. But actually, in the withdrawal agreement are all the things they want: GIs, the geographic indicators, the feta cheese, and all this sort of stuff. You can't have Wisconsin feta. You can only have Greek feta or whatever. All of that's already in there. So we have somehow allowed them to load up the withdrawal agreement with all the things they want. So we've got no levers later on. So we couldn't even, to go back to our would-be American trade deal, we couldn't even use a lever against the European Union to let us alter something to fit the American interest. Can't even do that, because all those levers have been taken away. So at several levels, it's very poor, and it shuts off spectacular opportunities. If you're running a company rather than a country, if you're running a company and your company had gone from 60% of its trade with one class of customer and 40% with customer B, and it switched around, and customer B was now 60% growing the biggest, so you'd be focusing on customer B. Well, for us, that's Europe and the rest of the world. Europe was 60%, now down to 45, I think it is. The rest of the world, 55, climbing to 60, and then probably 70 in due course. We are absolutely shutting ourselves off from our best future, and that includes America.
Strikes me as a sort of spectacular own goal, actually, on the British side, considering the amount of enthusiasm there is on the US side for a free trade agreement, including support in the White House, but also several congressional resolutions already backing a US-UK free trade deal. Owen, would you like to comment further on this?
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely tragic. I mean, because I can't think of two countries which are better suited to work with each other. The US worked with us. There's no sort of dive to the bottom. We've got very similar standards, very similar regulatory costs, wage rates. We're each the largest investor in each other's country. We each employ over 1 million of each other's citizens. Somehow, by a quirk of statistics, we each have a surplus with the other one, which I didn't quite follow, but and it's growing.
It's a counting problem.
Yeah, but it is growing. And as David just said, as I've just said, don't forget, our sales to the EU are only 8% of British companies sell to the EU. It's 12% of our GDP. And what is so tragic about the whole thing? It's all got snarled up with the excuse of the Irish border. So President Tusk made a generous free trade offer to us back in March, which foundered on the issue of the Irish border, because nobody looked at how it could be solved, apart from somehow bullying the UK into staying in some form of customs union arrangement with all the costs involved. And we've been working very carefully on this, and Shank has done a very important paper, the IEA, on a free trade deal. We and the European Research Group produced a paper on how you would use existing techniques, existing processes under existing EU law to continue trading, not just across the Irish border, but across Calais, Dover as well. And everything we've had in that paper I saw endorsed last week in Rotterdam. I was there for 2 days. And what is a complete nonsense is this statement we're getting out of the government that there is no alternative. There is a very clear alternative, and that is to embrace the offer from Tusk, but to solve the alleged problems on the Irish border with existing techniques and processes, all of which work this afternoon. They're working very well. And that's the most frustrating thing about it all. And if we did that, then bang, we wouldn't just be doing free trade deals with the United States, the largest economy in the world. That would open up Japan, the Pacific, and we would be flying. And we've seen that with other smaller countries. It's absolutely remarkable how successful really very small economies like New Zealand and Australia have been once they can get going and work closely with countries like China doing free trade deals. It's a huge increase in trade.
And so the May deal really, it's very bad news for the United States, as well as for Britain. And Shankar, you've studied this US-UK free trade issue extremely closely. Could you comment on the impact of this of the May deal on the prospects for US-UK free trade?
Well, I think you said to David, does it make it impossible? I think it does make it impossible. If you look at what the US asks are typically in any trade deal, they are things like, and I was a cleared advisor to the US government on regulatory issues, TBT, SPS, and so on. And the main issues are regulatory. They are regulatory with respect to goods. It's not just agriculture. It's goods, it's product regulation, it's European standards, it's agri-food and SPS issues on agriculture. And then to some extent, we'll have a back and forth on services and defense and other things where we have much more in alignment. But if you systematically take all those major asks of the US off the table, and you say, well, I'm sorry, we can't negotiate on goods because we've just committed ourselves through treaty harmonization to the EU rulebook, or we can't give you anything on agriculture because we've done the same thing with the EU rulebook, then fairly quickly the US will rightly say, well, what can you do? And if we can't, and if we want big things from the US-UK FTA, which we do, the US is not the most open country on financial services. The UK is very open on financial services. We would want to see more access there. We have a unique situation there, by the way, because we have regulators in New York, Washington, and London that are have more trust than any group of regulators anywhere on earth. So, and are used to working together, which is not the case with the EU. So we ought to be able to get very high-level deals in those areas. Defense is another area where we have a common approach here, and we could agree essentially that the UK would be part, as the Australians and the Canadians are already doing, to be part of a common defense area so that US regulation in defense is less anti-competitive and less distortive. And I know the Heritage Foundation has done a lot of work on that particular area. So I think there are a lot of, and there are asks that we would seek to make on government procurement and other areas where we would want the US to give us quite a lot, and we will not be able to get anything. We will not be able to get any of those unless we are able to have maximum control over our tariff schedules and maximum regulatory autonomy. And if we don't have either of those, and this deal takes both of those away, then the US will rightly turn around and say, well, you're just a mini version of the EU and you're not very interesting. I think this is the greatest tragedy of this deal, is it takes a country that could have been a major player in solving major global problems, and it makes it completely irrelevant for generations.
Yes. Yeah, it's astonishing how the British government has sort of undermined the British position, really, vis-a-vis.
I mean, this is a very good point, Niall, because one of the things that Barnier said in his press conference, and I believe it's true, is that we did these things because the UK asked us for them.
Yeah.
That is a shocking statement.
Absolutely extraordinary. And in many ways, this deal is a victory for the EU over British strategic interests, and that's certainly how it's being portrayed by many of its critics. And we saw today the resignation of 2 cabinet ministers, Dominic Raab, Esther McVeigh, and also several junior ministers as well. There will be, if indeed this moves forward, a likely vote in the House of Commons December 10th on the Theresa May proposal. How likely do you think, David, that this proposal will be defeated in the House of Commons if it actually gets to that stage?
Yeah, if it gets that far.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very likely to be defeated. I mean, just the sort of tactics of it, frankly, the Labour Party, who are important in this context, have taken a stance which has been quite aggressively critical of it, almost a Eurosceptic stance, which is quite amusing from them, but an aggressively critical stance. A large number of Conservatives against it, leavers like Owen and myself, very much so, but actually quite a few Remainers too. I mean, it is no source of pride for somebody who believes in staying in the European Union for us to be the rule takers in perpetuity. So it's failure there. There's also one other thing which we haven't mentioned in this context of our role in the world. One of the most important things that's happened to poverty in the world at large is the impact of free trade. Free trade has lifted billions out of abject poverty, probably saved millions, many millions of lives in the last few decades. The best exponents of free trade tend to be countries like ourselves, America, Canada. I mean, if you like, the common law countries, the countries for whom freedom is a very big central issue. What we've done here is taken the sort of keystone out of the arch, or the potential arch, in this respect. So there's a big moral case as well. So when some Europeans think about this, they may think, actually, this is a little bit of an own goal, even for them.
Yeah. And if indeed the proposal is defeated in the Commons, what happens next? And the question of both David and of Owen as well.
Well, we need to go back and reset it. I mean, we need to go back and say, okay, that doesn't work. Now, if you want your 39 billion and you want all the other bits and pieces of the withdrawal agreement that at least we can tolerate, then you have to, you have to talk to us again on a different basis. Now, both Owen and Shankar have been involved in lots and lots of very important work, whether it's the Northern Ireland border or whether it's borders generally, or whether it's the so-called Plan A+. What Plan A+ is the best possible free trade deal based pretty much entirely on European precedents. So they can't turn around and say, well, you can't have that. So, well, you've done it with South Korea, or you've done it with Canada, or you've done it with South Africa. And if we do that, we'll have something which is ready to go. I think we can bring them back to the table and do it again. But it won't be easy. It won't be easy. It will be extremely stressful the next 3 months, because we'll be on the brink of a no deal outcome. And although I don't fear no deal, I think it's not the best option. I don't fear it. The Europeans and a lot of the British government do fear it a lot.
Yes. Owen.
Well, we absolutely have to defeat it. It is so bad, not just for the country, but as we've touched on, world free trade. And I think we will defeat it in the Commons. What is really important is we get across our alternative. It is complete nonsense. It's this or nothing. And we're getting this slightly odd narrative that you either live with this or you don't get Brexit at all, or you live with this and you, quote, crash out. Now, it's perfectly obvious, optimal would be to have a very wide-ranging free trade deal as the IEA have come up with. That's obviously much the best arrangement, which would allow us to do free trade deals with the US and everything else. But I'm like David, I'm not that alarmed by world trade terms, because that is significantly better than where we are now with this proposal. I mean, it's absolutely clear. I would much prefer to get to the 29th of March with no deal and be out on world trade terms where we can at least decide our tariffs. Everyone assumes we're going to rocket the tariffs. We'd be very stupid to do that, in my thinking. But at least we would be in control of our own money. We wouldn't be paying the 39 billion. We wouldn't be paying what was it going to be, 20 billion if we get into the next payment round. We would have complete control of our regulation, and we have complete control of our tariff schedules. So that's not a bad start. The idea of all this stuff, this hysterics about queues at Dover, who says we're going to stop the trucks? We know perfectly well that the car parts coming from Germany conform. We know perfectly well that the cheese coming from France conforms. Why are they suddenly going to start putting nasties in it? And we get back to this utter nonsense we have with borders, that the vast majority of goods these days are pre-cleared. So I was in Rotterdam last week. I saw the most contentious products are food products. So of the 30,000 containers of chilled and frozen fish and meat, in theory, the European Union, well, in practice, says 100% are cleared. Correct, but not at the border. The border inspection post is 40 kilometers from where the containers land, and the process is nearly all a paper intelligence-based process. So yes, the container goes to the border inspection post, but the inspection is carried out on the paperwork. Is it a respectful company? Is it New Zealand shipper, which they've been dealing with for years with proper veterinary practices? Or is it from somewhere else, possibly South America, where there might be a problem with foot and mouth? If it's the latter category, that's probably 2 to 3%. Even of those, the 2 to 3%, only about 10% of those are actually checked. So this is how borders work these days. Borders are tax points. They're not inspection points. And so I'm not really, a lot of this is Project Fear. We got about Project Fear, Mark, at least 7 or 8 by now. So I'm not so worried about that. Much the best would be to have an all-embracing free trade deal. So if we can get rid of this awful proposal yesterday, just get that voted down, we could want to move on rapidly to what we're proposing, which we have gone through in detail and had endorsed by real experts.
It may be of interest to your audience, because I mean they weren't have followed all the British press on this sort of stuff. But we've had scare stories in the last 6 months about running out of insulin. Well, we're not going to run out of insulin. We've talked to the companies, and they're perfectly happy. Of running out of food, you know, it's vaguely ridiculous. You know, we've had 5-week French lorry driver strikes completely blocked up the Dover-Calais link, and we didn't run out of anything, frankly. Two things to say. Number one, on this question of dealing across borders, north of here, northwest of here, Detroit, you've got the US, a big chunk of the US car industry, Ford in particular there. Just north of them, in Ontario, southwest Ontario, there is a huge industry, a huge supply chain industry, all of which comes across the choke point at Detroit. You know, it comes across, I think, a tunnel and 2 bridges from memory. But they still work perfectly well. The biggest selling pickup truck in the world, the Ford pickup truck, all of its engines are made in Windsor, over the border. Now, if there were real problems in dealing with borders and just-in-time systems, they wouldn't do it. Ford would be very ruthless about that. They wouldn't do it. So it could be done. Second point to make on the French. A lot of people presume that the French are going to be difficult and awkward with us. You know, they're going to, you know, sort of start the 100 Years' War or something. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous sort of concerns. The thing to understand is we do hear a lot of sort of, how can I say, robust language, put it politely, robust language from the French government. But when you look at what's happening locally, you know, you'll find they're making special arrangements to reduce the inspection rate on vehicles coming through. They're making special arrangements to have fast pass arrangements. So this is classification of drivers, so that they know the driver is trustworthy. You know, same as you have on the US border. They're making special arrangements. They're picking places outside town, just like Rotterdam, to do animal inspections if needed, and so on and so on. There's a whole series of things going on in order to facilitate this. So when it comes to it, there may be a hiccup or two in the first year if we have a sort of no-deal outcome, but they will be resolved quite quickly because it's very much in their own interest to do so. Second thing, or the last thing I'll say about the so-called no-deal outcome, the WTO outcome, is that it probably won't last. That actually, if there are any hiccups, the Europeans will be negotiating with us to get the free trade deal. You know, so it will very, very quickly morph into a free trade deal after the event with any pressures that arise. So it's not something to fear. It's not the best outcome. It's not what I would pick, but it's definitely not something to be afraid of.
I think the problem is that we've allowed ourselves to become trapped into a very legalistic process. And we're worrying about the number of angels dancing on the head of a pin and time-looped backstops to backstops, etc. This is all nonsense. And I think if we can, what we need to do is to reset this process so that we can have a sensible, pragmatic, political track approach to this problem. And all of us, I think, have spent a significant amount of time now with Michel Barnier. I think we all would agree that the Europeans, had we presented and if we present sensible free trade agreement-based proposals based on their own offer, which, as I say, which I repeat, is a free trade agreement with the whole of the UK, with regulatory cooperations, customs facilitations, and Irish border facilitations. That is their offer. It remains their offer, contrary to what the government in the UK has said. If we could build on that, then I think we can get a successful result. And what we have to do, though, is honour their desire, which we have not done so far, for the integrity of their single market and customs union. As long as we do that, then I think there is a basis for a deal. I think looking forward to the next 2-4 weeks, there's going to be chaos in the UK. There's going to be turbulence. There's going to be a lot of China smashed on the floor and so on. And it's easy to think...
Gordon Brown doesn't work there anymore.
It's easy to think that this is a bad thing. It's easy to read the headlines and think, oh, this is a terrible thing. I would suggest that the terrible thing would be to actually make the UK completely irrelevant in trade policy terms, damage the UK economy, make it a rule taker for generations. I suspect the only way that we can have this reset is to actually allow this legalistic process to hit the buffers, to take a step back and say, no, we made a mistake. We've wasted a lot of time, but here's what we both want to do. Here's what we both want to achieve. Let's get on with the work of negotiating a sensible free trade agreement. And here, I think, our allies, who have done everything we have asked of them. The Americans have done everything that we've asked of them. The Japanese have done everything, mostly everything, that we've asked of them. I mean, they've said very clearly they want the UK to be in the CPTPP. They want us to submit a letter as early as January. They want us to be one of the earliest countries to be members of the TPP. But, our allies have done everything that we could possibly have asked of them. It's up to us to now uphold, our end of the bargain. So I would say, let's get through this next period. It's not going to be pleasant. It's going to be full of blood and very ugly. But let's get through it. Let's get through it quickly. Let's have the reset. Let's start negotiating a proper trade deal. And I think there is ample political will on both sides in that case to do so. And I would say that to the Americans, to the Japanese, to the South Koreans, to managers of global supply chains, I would say you need to row behind the UK and the EU in seeking to have a comprehensive free trade agreement with the maximum of regulatory cooperations and facilitations, because that's good for you. It's good for you as a manager of global supply chains, and it will also enable the UK to play the role that you need it to play on the global stage.
So, thank you, Shankar. And
I think an incredibly important point is the politics of this.
Yeah.
I mean, do not underestimate the shattering damage to the integrity of our political institutions if we do not deliver what the 17.4 million people voted for. And the 16.4, well, the 85% actually, in the general election who voted Conservative, Labour and DUP, which was an interpretation to, I said before, leave the single market, leave the customs union, leave the remit of the ECJ. And those people are absolutely staunch. They were bombarded with propaganda during the referendum. George Osborne spent £9 million on public propaganda on a leaflet which went to every house. They were told there would be complete idiots to vote to leave, and they ignored it. We've then had, I think, 4, 5, 6 more project fears. They are completely unmoved. The polls show they voted to leave. They want us to leave, and they're absolutely clear about that. The establishment hates this. The European establishment hates it. The Dublin establishment hates it. The London establishment hates it. The political establishment in the UK hates it. The media establishment hates it. The commercial establishment hates it. And what will be very clear, well, the establishments will have conspired against the people, and there will be real long-lasting damage. Forget the Tory party. The Tory party will be out quite, and justifiably, for a couple of generations, I would suggest. But there will be real lasting damage to our institutions. And people come up to me, you know, I don't do that much media, people come up to me on trains, I was racing on Saturday, come up to me and say, Mr. Patterson, it's going to happen, isn't it? They're not going to trick us. It is going to happen. You're not going to let us down. And the other variant that they say, touching on the disruption, is, you know, we voted to leave, because and I remember this on referendum day, people come out to me at the end of the day say, it's about them, isn't it? We can get rid of you. It's actually quite tough in North Shropshire, but you can vote to get rid of the MP in North Shropshire.
Yeah, normally only by assassination.
Yeah. But you can't get rid of them. It's them, isn't it? And all this stuff about all the motives for voting, it was very clear. People voted in order to get democratic control of the people who make their laws, and if they pass bad laws, get rid of them, raise their taxes, and if they spend the tax money badly, get rid of them. There is absolutely no way you can vote for a European Commissioner, and there's absolutely no way you can vote to get rid of one. Yeah. And that's the most fundamental basis. So we must not forget this. They have been completely staunch. Yeah. The polls have not moved an inch. But if yesterday goes through, they will be furious, and quite rightly so.
My favourite quote of the referendum campaign, you know, after the Metropolitan establishment described the people who voted to leave as bigoted, old, uneducated, provincial, I mean, you name it, was a builder who, I think he was a bricklayer initially. He started his own firm, half a dozen or a dozen employees. So, no, not enormously wealthy, but the sort of salt of the earth, really. And when George Osborne made this forecast of £4,000 lost per family in 2030 or whatever it would be. I mean, how he can forecast 15 years when he can't forecast 5 months, I don't know, but there we are. Anyway, he said £4,000 per family in 2030, and this builder says, £4,000 for my freedom, cheap at the price, he said. Yeah? And that, I think, actually encapsulates much more than all this other nonsense, what the people really think. And they will not be happy if they're denied their freedom for a mess of pottage. Absolutely,
a very emphatic statement there. And I'd now actually like to invite questions from the audience. Please do identify yourself and any affiliation you may have. And also, please keep your questions short and to the point, and that way we can have a significant number of questions. So I'm going to take a question from this gentleman here. Yeah.
Shot, Center for Financial Stability. Given how bad this seems to be on its face, what do you see as the role for the 1922 committee in the Parliament?
David, would you like to?
I thought you were going to ask somebody else.
I was
hoping you were going to ask somebody else.
I'll let them handle it.
I've sort of taken a self-denying ordinance that we don't comment on things like leadership issues, which are what I think Charles is referring to there. And I'm not really going to break it. When American politicians go abroad, they don't criticise the president directly. I think the simple truth is, one way or another, this policy is going to come to an end. My preference is the policy is stopped and reversed and replaced, and I'll leave it at that.
Owen, would you like to comment on that, or leave it at?
Well, no, I think there's a very well-grounded tradition. You don't attack your political leaders when you go abroad. You wouldn't like it if your president was attacked when it went to London. But I'm entirely like David. I mean, I've had meetings with the Prime Minister on this issue, explaining our proposals, and I would just like her to go back to her election manifesto, the speech she made at Lancaster House, and deliver that, and we'll all be happy. You know, we are the mainstream. Don't forget, it's really important. We are the mainstream. All we want to see is our manifesto delivered. I'm described as a hard Brexiteer and a member of the ERG, and you know, I eat sort of raw babies for breakfast.
I thought they were cooked.
No, have them raw. All we want to see is the vote of the 17.4 million and the 85% of the general election delivered. That's all we want. And we have overwhelming support with our membership and with those who voted, as we just talked on in the previous question.
Right, I had a, let me see here. Okay, this gentleman right here in the front.
Hi, my name's William Cox. I'm with the John Locke Institute. First of all, thank you so much for coming out today. I really enjoyed it. Mr. Patterson, sir, earlier on in the discussion, you mentioned a statistic that 12% of trade from the UK was going out to the EU. And I was just wondering where that comes from, because I read in the ONS's report of the UK trade that 44% of trade was going out to the EU. 12% might be something I'm willing to forego to reclaim sovereignty and escape the clutch of the bureaucrats in the EU. But I was just wondering about that statistic and whether you could tell me more.
It's 12% of our GDP. That's what it is. And it's declining. So since 1998, our sales of goods actually to the EU have grown by, I think, 0.2% a year. Our sales to the rest of the world have grown at 3.3%. That's 16 times faster. So we now have a surplus, I think I touched on this, 41 billion surplus of the rest of the world. We have a massive, over 81 billion deficit with the EU. So the economics are absolutely screamingly obvious. The rest of the world is growing. And I said, the Commission said that. The Commission said 95% of world growth is going to be outside the European Union. So we want the best possible relations with the EU and want to carry on trading with them. But I don't really see why we have to spend 39 billion, which popped up, by the way, to 46.8 billion in the budget, for the privilege of selling to them. We sell to the United States very happily. We don't give the United States a penny. We sell to the Chinese very happily. We don't give the Chinese a penny.
The distinction is between proportion of GDP and proportion of trade. Basically, that's what it is. I mean, to put the hard numbers for you, the economy is what, about 3 trillion, something like that, something of that order. The exports to the European Union is about the imports from the European Union about 320 billion, exports are about 200 and something billion. So those are the sort of size of numbers you're talking about there.
Excellent. And so the next question, right here, actually.
It's not a question, it's more of the way of a comment. Dan Mulhall is my name, Ambassador of Ireland to the United States. I know both the panelists from my time as Ambassador in the UK. And in fact, I must confess...
Great ambassador, best parties in London.
Indeed. Thank you. No, I must confess, I always got on very well with David Davis because I always felt he was open and warm and friendly and approachable. And I was sorry that he didn't stay on as Brexit Secretary. I thought he was doing a very good job in my time there. I don't know what happened after I left, but anyway, things have changed since then. I didn't come here. It's my first time at the Heritage Foundation, and thank you very much for the invitation. But I didn't come here to argue with the panelists at all by any means. Intelligent, well-intentioned, good people who can have disagreements about issues, and it should be like that between Britain and Ireland also. What I would say is that I represent an independent, sovereign, free country that is also a member of the European Union. We don't see any discrepancy, we don't see any problem with those two statements being made together. Also, Ireland has benefited hugely from EU membership. Our relations with Britain actually benefited hugely as well. And our concern at the moment really is I fully respect the outcome of the referendum in Britain. I was there at the time, and I saw what happened, and I fully accept the outcome. And what we're trying to do now is to minimise the damage to Ireland, to Northern Ireland, to British-Irish relations, to our obviously we've got major concerns about the border. Want to keep that border open. So does the British government. We're agreed on that. Also, we want to protect the Good Friday Agreement. So there's no question that the Irish government in any way is trying to undermine the Good Friday Agreement. And we think that this proposal, well, it's not ideal. It certainly seems to me to point towards very serious negotiations in the next year and a half to try to arrive at the kind of outcome that the panelists were looking towards, an outcome where there would be free and untrammeled trade between the the UK and the European Union. We hope, therefore, that, that somehow we will be able to get an agreement in the coming weeks, and that we can move on in the next year and a half or so to actually find those solutions that haven't been available so far. But I would say that there's very good will across the European Union, certainly in Ireland, to try to avoid a breach with Britain, to keep Britain. I mean, for us, the key thing is we want to keep Britain as closely connected with us and with the European Union as possible, so that our trade and economic cooperation with Britain, the people-to-people connections, the political ties that have strengthened in recent years can be preserved. And we also want to preserve the peace process in Northern Ireland. And while we have a different conclusion from the one drawn by David Davis and Owen Patterson and others, I would make the point that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Karen Bradley, I just saw today in the car coming down here that she's come out and said that she believes that this agreement is something that she believes will support political progress in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Owen, would you like to respond at all? I've spent a lot of time in...
yeah, I'm very happy to. I mean, I did a lot of business in Ireland, north and south of the border before I got to Parliament. I was the shadow for Secretary of State for 3 years. I went there every week. I went to all sorts of places all along the border, actually, where I probably couldn't possibly go now. And I was the real Secretary of State for 2 years. And I still go there quite a lot privately. I'm absolutely clear that the answer to the problem of the border is what we are proposing, which is to use existing systems. So there is a border now. There is a tax border, there's a VAT border, there's a currency border, there's very much an excise duty border, and very importantly, there's a security border, which is very much respected. And it all works with existing technologies. The trade across the border is, in UK terms, tiny. It's very important for those who live there, but it is regular, repetitive shipments of mainly agri-food products. So it reps 4.9% of Northern Ireland sales go south of the border, 1.6% of the Republic of Ireland's exports go north. So the sales south is 0.2% of UK GDP. And it's large quantities of milk going to Patrick. It's the same milk from the same cows on the same farms, in the same tanker, on the same road, to the same destination every day. Huge French company, very respectable. They're not going to cheat or do anything silly. Diageo, the shipments of Guinness, about 18,000 border crossings for Guinness, another huge, very professional multinational. And what's so good about these products, actually, because they are agri-food, they're very, very closely regulated. Every bullock has an ear tag, every sheep has an ear tag. And this is a very highly regulated industry. And it is well suited to concepts like authorized economic operators, the whole Traces scheme, which works very well across Europe now, the whole Rex stuff on rules of origin, that all works extremely well. And as I said, I spent a couple of days in Rotterdam last week seeing how they handle it. Everything I saw confirms that borders are tax points. They are not inspection points. And we can handle the border. All this stuff about hard infrastructure, it is complete, utter nonsense. We had a hard border during the terrible troubles. We had 27,000 armed police and military north of the border. And don't forget, the Republic had significant activity as well with their security services. And lots of roads were blocked off, and it just didn't work. The locals either filled in the holes, or they went over the ditches, or they went round. It did not work. It was completely pointless to even talk about having any sort of infrastructure on the border. It is totally unnecessary. And it's a bit odd when the UK government said it doesn't want a hard border, the Dublin government says it doesn't want a hard border, the European Union says it doesn't want a hard border. We're still talking about this nonsense about a hard border. There is not going to be a hard border. What you're going to have is intelligence-led customs and pre-clearance, as happens on every border around the world at the moment. And that is the answer to it. And then just to touch on, the Ambassador touched on the Good Friday Agreement. I see much the biggest danger to the Good Friday Agreement would be real damage to the Southern Irish rural economy, which does worry me. You know, if we were to go to World Trade Centre, if we were stupid enough to put up high tariffs, that is incredibly damaging to Ireland's dairy and beef industry, where the UK is easily the biggest market. And then you cannot underestimate the damage to the peace process and the Belfast Agreement by having a different regime in Northern Ireland. That was an absolutely clear basis for getting unionist support, was the principle of consent. public withdrew Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution, the claim on the North, and Unionists were convinced by David Trimble and others that the status of Northern Ireland could not change without a majority popular vote called a border poll. And the border poll can only be called when the Secretary of State thinks that there is a chance of a united Ireland winning. Well, that's not happened. Yesterday, there was just a unilateral announcement. The Cabinet was bullied. They were expected to read 700 pages or whatever it was in 3 hours, weren't even allowed to take a copy away. That is a flagrant breach of the most important core of the Belfast Agreement. And having gone there a lot and seeing the enormous benefits we've got from the peace process, the extraordinary cooperation we got from the bipartisan approach in Dublin, the bipartisan approach in London, the bipartisan approach here in Washington, you know, the human gains in Ireland are absolutely colossal and to be taken very, very seriously. And I do believe yesterday is far more of a threat than all this talk about the border, which is simply not going to happen.
Yeah. Can I, since
Yes.
the ambassador was so kind about me, let me just make one or two sort of factual comments about the background, because the rest of the ambassador obviously knows this, but the rest of the audience may not. Since 1923, British citizens in Ireland and Irish citizens in the UK have been treated identically.
Yeah.
Have been treated identically. 1949 Act, I think so, healthcare, pensions, whatever it may be, you're treated exactly the same. This is an incredibly important part of our relationship, and it's a very close relationship. I mean, when Ireland had its financial problems some years ago, I think it was 3 or 4 billion we loaned as well. Why? Because we see Ireland's being very closely related to us, and I have to say, it's having a bit of a hiccup at the moment, but I think modern times has really been seen as the golden era of Anglo-Irish relationships. And when the Queen came, it was a spectacular success. You know? And I'm hoping we're going to see a return to that. When I said earlier, by the way, that you know, I wasn't afraid of the no deal outcome, one thing I would say is, and one of the reasons I don't think it's the optimum outcome or the best outcome, is actually that it would put the Irish rural economy at risk. It will put other countries at risk in other ways, Belgium and the Netherlands and so on. And these are our friends. We're leaving the European Union, but we're not leaving our friends behind. These are our friends and allies. And it's very, very important we think about their interest as well as our own.
If I can add something, because we've done a lot of work on the Irish border. I think there are, and you know, you can read a lot of the stuff that we've done at the IEA on technical solutions to the Irish border, and I agree with you that the goal should be not to harden the border in ways that damage the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, and that should be our goal. I think we've been somewhat sidetracked by this rather ludicrous backstop discussion. What we should be focused on is what's the permanent solution to ensure that result can be achieved and the Irish border can be preserved in that way, or the current arrangements can be preserved in that way. And the heart of that is agreeing a modern customs and trade facilitation chapter, because as Owen says, never mind the Irish border, in customs generally around the world, in border management generally around the world, we are moving away from inspecting goods and tying forms to the transfer of goods to systems-based processes where you tie the inspections and the intelligence to the actual trader. Now, across the Irish border, you have a very unusual situation, whereas you have very, very limited number of large company trade. You have trade across the border, Republic of Ireland trade with mainland GB, Northern Ireland trade with mainland GB, both of those dwarf cross-border trade. But what you do have across the border is a lot of high-frequency, high-volume trade that lends itself to those kinds of facilitations and techniques. One of the things the British government has said, which I think is disingenuous to the Europeans, is that we want an exemption for all these small traders. Well, obviously that cuts into their single market and customs union. But all of these small traders are filling in VAT forms anyway, because there is a VAT border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So actually, having a system where they do fill in forms, but they add a column to their VAT form, is a way of lowering the perception of the hardening that border. Now, we've proposed 50 technical solutions that we think all taken together would work to not harden the Irish border, but none of these will work unless the people of the island of Ireland actually believe in them and politically, diplomatically believe in them. So I think it's very important for pragmatic people on both sides of the border to come together about a permanent solution. Never mind the backstop and the legalisms of the way that we're negotiating. These are people's lives. We need to get beyond this, and we need to say, look, if pragmatic people on both sides of the border think this sort of system can work, then we need to be able to deliver it. And I think it is eminently deliverable. And in fact, I'd go further and say, actually, because of the nature of the Irish border, the kinds of solutions that could be applied on it ultimately could be applied to the management of all UK borders. Not immediately, but ultimately. And I think that should be a goal of both the EU and the UK government.
Thanks, Shankar, for that. And we're running out of time, and I'll ask a question over here first, and then I'll ask a final question at the end. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, Damien Life, Daniel Morgan School of National Security. So I just want to ask perhaps a broad question, but to what extent do you agree with the fact that the negotiations were destined to fail and not produce the desired outcome before they'd even begun, because of the distinction made between soft Brexit and hard Brexit? And that distinction was made, and if so, why was it not possible to combat this kind of distinction being made?
Yeah, it's a good question. What was apparent from the beginning of this negotiating process is it was going to be very unusual, because it was done basically on a public stage, with all of the pre-positions taken in public, and therefore you're bound to get clashes where somebody's got to back down. And at the same time, you've got large numbers of people in Britain who didn't like the process at all, and therefore they're the ones who primarily were going on about soft and hard Brexit and so on. The truth is, it's incredibly hard to define what people mean by soft and hard Brexit. A hard Brexit is something that Remainer disapproves of. It could be anything. What we were looking to do, and we tried to repeat this argument over and over again, that we're looking for the best possible Brexit, and define that by one that gives us the freedom to do what we need to do, gives us the opportunity to go out into the world, and so on. So it wasn't destined to fail, but it was destined to be difficult. There's no two ways about that. What I do regret about the process is something else, and that is that because it went the way it did, people like me, were spending all our time, if you like, on what you might think of as defensive arguments. It's not going to do this harm, it's not going to do that harm, it's not. Whereas actually, the most important arguments about Brexit, about the opportunities, the gains, the possibilities, and they're not all economic. There are other gains in terms of the way the country sees itself, the way the country thinks about itself. And I was reading an article only the other day about all of the other things, sort of almost the accidental benefits of Brexit. So it wasn't destined to fail. It won't fail. It will be scary. I mean, it will be, people will be sweating a bit when we get to the end. I was once criticised by the London Times. I went on a radio program, and the commentator said to me, he said, "Well, what's the most important thing about your job? Is it knowing the detail of the European law? Is it being a great negotiating tactician?" He went through a whole series of things, and I said, "No, none of the above." He said, "Well, what is it?" I said, "Being calm, being calm." And the London Times dedicated a whole editorial to attacking me for saying being calm is important, but it is. We will go through some very stressful times, but as long as we keep our eye on the final target is to achieve the benefits that we want to achieve, and also make sure that all our friends and allies come out of it well too, then we'll get there.
Excellent. Well, I think that's an excellent point to bring the discussion to an end. Unless actually Owen and Shankar have a quick word.
I would like to make one point. This is a constitutional novelty for us. So in the past, whenever we've had a referendum in the UK, the establishment has called the referendum and has happily had the establishment view endorsed. So staying in the European community in '72, the devolution referendums in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales by the most tiny margin, but still, happily, the result was what the establishment wanted. We had the AV referendum under the coalition. It didn't go the way the Liberal Democrats wanted it, but broadly, the establishment liked it. For the first time ever, the people have given the wrong answer, and the establishment is appalled. And of course, there's a tradition in Europe of ignoring the results when they go wrong and telling people to go away and have another think. So there have been 48 referendums since the community was established in Europe, all of which endorsed further integration. Complete silence. I think there have been, what, 3 that went the wrong way: Ireland, Denmark,
France,
and Holland. And they were told to go away and come up with the right answer. And there's this wonderful, I think it's Juncker quote, isn't there? You know, if they say yes, on we go. If they say no, we tell them to think again. And I think to the horror of the European establishment, for the first time it looked as if we were going to stick to this. What did not help was significant members of the UK establishment constantly going over, you know, Mr. Blair, who's totally discredited in the UK, but he seemed to be a serious figure in the Commission, going over and undermining the efforts of the government. So, as David said, there's been this extraordinary pantomime going on the whole time. You did not have clean result, 70.4 million, bang, we're going to deliver it. You've had a constant run of criticism and carping and going over and over and over all the tired old arguments of the referendum. And I think that has been very, very damaging to the process.
Shanker, you have the final word.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I agree with you. There is no such thing as soft Brexit and hard Brexit. This kind of language it's not like some, you know, boiled egg or something. I mean, this is a serious process, and we have to apply serious thinking and serious analysis to it. Unfortunately, I think one of the effects of the UK's EU membership over this time, with respect to trade policy at least, and certain other areas, is that there has been a hollowing out of UK institutions, and the ability to have that apply that critical thinking, I think, has been lost. It's a lot easier to speculate about who the Prime Minister is going to be than to actually deal with the hard details and substance of what we need to be talking about. And there's all this nonsense about soft. I am constantly called a hard Brexiteer, despite the fact that I was the first person, even before the government, who called for an interim period in February of 2017. I have consistently called for a free trade agreement with the UK and the EU. That is based on maximal regulatory cooperation and facilitations. So if I'm a hard Brexiteer, what is the alternative? So I think it's unfortunately it's been a complete waste of time. We have also wasted an enormous amount of time negotiating with ourselves. It's an irony of the sort of fog in Channel continent cut off. That we have this weird combination of being almost terrified and lacking in confidence of our own ability to survive on the global stage, while at the same time coming up ourselves with ridiculous arrangements that don't make any international trading sense, like the facilitated customs arrangement, by ourselves, like in a room by ourselves, without any paying any attention to our trading partners or the EU. So all of this has to change. We have to have serious people who are applying serious thinking to this. We have to stop bifurcating the EU policy from the rest of the world policy. International trade policy is a single whole. We have to have a single mind over all of it, so trade-offs and read across can be done. Now, I think that if we do those things, if we actually change direction, if we start recognizing the European interest in protection of their single market and customs union, and we start negotiating from there, I am absolutely certain we will get a comprehensive trade deal of some description. We may not get everything we want. We may not get every regulatory cooperation we want, but we will get a trade deal. It will be workable. It will be worked on in the future. And we will have the ability to execute an independent trade policy with the rest of the world. So I have no doubt that that is possible, and we can achieve those goals. But it will require a change of direction. It will not happen on the current trajectory.
Thank you very much, Shanker. And it's been a terrific discussion, a very timely discussion. One thing's certain, it's going to be a real roller coaster ride in London in the next few weeks. We're very grateful for our three tremendous speakers for joining us today at such an important time. And we very much hope that you will come back to Heritage again in the very near future. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you as well to our audience for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.